The man who defined American cool for half a century hasn't been seen in public for 3 months, and those closest to him say he's preparing for an ending nobody wants to acknowledge. Behind every rugged role Robert Redford played, from the Sundance Kid to Roy Hobbs in The Natural, lies a devastating pattern of loss that would break most people. 2 sons dead, friends vanished, and now a diagnosis that explains why Hollywood's golden boy has been saying goodbye without using the word. What you're about to discover will change how you see every confident smile he ever gave. From unimaginable family tragedies to the disease he's fought to hide, this is why Robert Redford built Sundance. Not to celebrate film, but to outrun ghosts that finally caught him. If Robert Redford ever made you believe in heroes, leave a like below. There's a silence in Robert Redford's childhood that shaped everything. The sound of his mother Martha's labored breathing as she slowly died from septicemia when he was 18. A death that came after years of watching her fade from the vibrant woman who taught him to paint into someone he didn't recognize. Long before the world would know him as Hollywood's golden boy, he was Charles Robert Redford Jr. in Santa Monica, California, learning that beauty could vanish and security was an illusion. Robert was born on August 18, 1936, to Charles Sr., an accountant at Standard Oil who believed in rigid discipline and emotional distance, and Martha Hart Redford, a gifted artist who never got to pursue her dreams. The family lived modestly, but beneath the California sunshine lay shadows. His father's alcoholism that he hid behind closed doors, his mother's undiagnosed depression that manifested in days when she couldn't leave her bed. The defining trauma came earlier than Martha's death. When Robert was 6, his uncle David was found dead in his apartment, having taken his own life after returning from World War II. The family never spoke about it directly, but Robert overheard whispered conversations about battle fatigue and couldn't adjust. The message was clear. Suffering was shameful, mental struggle was weakness, and men didn't discuss their pain. His father's response to any emotional display was swift and harsh. Tears meant punishment, fear meant ridicule. "My father believed emotions were a luxury we couldn't afford," Redford would later reflect. He'd lost his own father young and decided feeling nothing was better than feeling too much. School was Robert's escape, but also another source of trauma. Diagnosed with what would now be recognized as severe ADHD, he couldn't sit still, couldn't focus, was constantly in trouble for disruption. Teachers labeled him problematic, unfocused, likely to amount to nothing. He was held back in 3rd grade, the humiliation so intense he developed a stutter that took years to overcome. His mother, the one person who understood his artistic temperament, grew increasingly ill throughout his childhood. By the time he was 15, she was spending more time in hospitals than at home, her blood poisoning spreading slowly through her system while doctors tried ineffective treatments. The family's financial situation deteriorated as medical bills mounted. Charles Sr. began drinking more heavily, coming home later, sometimes not at all. Robert, at 16, was essentially raising himself, working part-time jobs to buy food when his father forgot to leave money. He'd skip school to sit with his mother in the hospital, reading to her from art books, pretending everything would be fine. "I learned to perform happiness," he once admitted in a rare moment of vulnerability. To be the son she needed to see, not the terrified kid watching his mother disappear. When Martha died in 1955, just after Robert's high school graduation, his father completely withdrew. They lived in the same house, but as strangers, Charles Sr. drinking himself to sleep, Robert planning his escape. His mother's death certificate listed the cause as septicemia, but Robert knew the truth was more complex. She'd given up fighting, worn down by chronic illness, poverty, and a marriage that had become a prison. That silence, that inability to speak truth about pain, never truly disappeared. It only learned to hide beneath charm, beneath success, beneath characters who were always moving too fast to be caught by their own grief. The boy who watched his mother die slowly would become the man who built an empire on independent voices. But first, he had to survive the silence. At 23, Robert Redford stood outside the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, having just been expelled for excessive drinking and missing classes. His art professor's final words echoing, "You have talent, but you're running from something that's going to catch you anyway." The year was 1959, and Redford had already failed at the University of Colorado, dropping out after a year of baseball, fraternity parties, and alcohol-fueled attempts to forget his mother's death. He traveled to Europe on his father's reluctant loan, studying painting in Paris and Florence, but spent more time in bars than studios, drinking with expatriates who'd also fled something back home. Now he was in New York, sleeping on friends' couches, working as a janitor at CBS studios, watching real actors rehearse while he mopped floors. There was no plan B, he would later admit. Either I found something that made sense of the chaos, or I'd follow my Uncle David's path. Those first years in New York were exercises in rejection that confirmed his worst fears about himself. Redford's stutter returned under stress during auditions, making him freeze mid-sentence while casting directors checked their watches. He was told he was too pretty, too California, lacking gravitas, better suited for modeling than serious theater. Between 1957 and 1959, he auditioned for over 200 roles, landing exactly 3, all non-speaking parts as corpses or background drunks, which felt appropriately symbolic. He survived on peanut butter sandwiches and coffee, lost 30 pounds he couldn't afford to lose, developed insomnia that would plague him for decades. The breakthrough from invisibility came through the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, where he'd enrolled using the last of his father's money. His teacher, Uta Hagen, saw something others missed, that his inability to be present wasn't lack of talent, but excess of pain. "Stop running from whatever you're running from," she told him after a particularly disastrous scene. "Use it instead." That advice led to his first real role in Tall Story on Broadway in 1959, playing a basketball player, fitting for someone who'd once had athletic dreams before alcohol derailed them. The play flopped, but casting director Stark Hesseltine noticed Redford's uncomfortable authenticity, the way he seemed to be barely holding something back. The real shift came through television, the medium theater actors scorned, but which paid rent. Redford appeared in Maverick, The Untouchables, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, usually playing cowboys or criminals, men who kept moving because stopping meant confronting something. He was making $400 per episode, enough to marry Lola Van Wagenen in 1958 and start a family, but success felt hollow. "I was functioning," he recalled, "but not living. Every role was just another costume to hide in, but fate operates on its own timeline." In 1960, Redford was cast in The Highest Tree on Broadway, his first significant stage role. The play closed after 21 performances, but director Mike Nichols saw Redford's barely controlled intensity and recommended him for Barefoot in the Park in 1963. The role of Paul Bratter, the uptight newlywed, required Redford to be charming while suggesting deeper complications underneath. He prepared by not preparing, letting his natural discomfort with emotional display become the character. The play was a hit, running for 1,530 performances. Then came the call from Hollywood, the film version of Barefoot in the Park in 1967, opposite Jane Fonda. Redford was 31, older than most breakthrough stars, carrying a decade of rejection and loss. But resurrection from invisibility had finally begun. The golden boy image everyone would remember was about to be born, though it was really just another performance by someone who'd learned that showing your real self meant risking everything. The role of the Sundance Kid in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid wasn't supposed to transform Robert Redford into a superstar. Paul Newman was the draw. Redford was just the pretty sidekick that Steve McQueen, Warren Beatty, and Marlon Brando had all passed on. Fox executives wanted someone more established, more masculine, less soft. Director George Roy Hill fought for Redford after seeing him in Barefoot in the Park, recognizing something others missed, that his apparent lightness masked something darker. Redford was 32, already feeling like his window was closing when he got the call. He had exactly 2 weeks to prepare, learning to quick draw, ride horses at full gallop, and develop chemistry with Newman, who initially resented sharing top billing with someone he considered a lightweight. Behind the scenes, Redford was channeling personal devastation into performance. His first son, Scott, had been born in 1959 with sudden infant death syndrome barely avoided through emergency intervention, leaving Redford perpetually anxious about loss. During filming in 1968, he'd receive multiple calls daily checking on his children, convinced something terrible would happen if he wasn't vigilant. He couldn't sleep in the location hotels, instead walking the Mexican desert at night, practicing dialogue with no one listening. "I wasn't playing Sundance," he later admitted. "I was playing someone who'd learned to smile while expecting catastrophe." The physical demands were intentionally punishing. Redford did his own stunts, including the cliff jump into water that insurance explicitly forbade. He wanted to feel real danger, later explaining that controlled fear was better than the shapeless anxiety I carried everywhere. The famous bicycle scene with "Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head" required 17 takes because Redford kept breaking character, the lightness feeling false. Newman noticed Redford's hands shaking between takes, assumed it was nerves about working with an established star. It was actually Redford fighting panic attacks he'd hidden since his mother's death. When Butch Cassidy released in October 1969, it exploded beyond anyone's expectations, earning $102 million domestically against a $6 million budget. Redford wasn't just Newman's sidekick, he was the revelation. Critics called him effortlessly charismatic, the perfect American hero, not knowing his charm was carefully constructed armor. His salary jumped from $150,000 to $2 million overnight. Suddenly, Robert Redford wasn't just employed, he was essential. Every studio wanted him, offering projects that would define the 1970s. But even at this pinnacle moment, darkness crept in. Success felt unearned, like he tricked everyone with his golden boy facade. "I had everything I'd claimed to want," Redford reflected years later, "except any sense of deserving it. Every good review felt like a lie I'd have to live up to." The fame was suffocating. Photographers following his family, his children becoming targets for kidnapping threats that kept him awake at night. He started building the idea of Sundance not as a festival, but as an escape, a place where he could control something in a life that felt increasingly out of control. The Sundance Kid made him a star, but it also crystallized his fear that he was only valuable as an image, a projection of American masculinity that had nothing to do with who he really was. The boy from Santa Monica who'd watched his mother die had become exactly what she'd never lived to see, and that success felt like betrayal. He had the career everyone wanted, but it was built on pretending to be someone who didn't wake up terrified every morning that it would all disappear, or worse, that it wouldn't, and he'd have to keep pretending forever. By 1973, Robert Redford wasn't just a movie star. He was Hollywood's most bankable leading man, commanding $2 million per film plus percentage points, having transformed from supporting player to the face that launched 1,000 magazine covers. That year alone saw him dominate with The Sting, reuniting with Paul Newman for a film that earned $160 million domestically, and The Way We Were, opposite Barbra Streisand, which became the year's third highest-grossing film. His production company, Wildwood Enterprises, gave him unprecedented creative control. He owned vast swaths of Utah land that would become Sundance Resort, worth millions even then. The man who'd been rejected for being too soft was now defining American masculinity, working exclusively with directors like Sidney Pollack, George Roy Hill, and Arthur Penn. Every script worth reading passed through his hands first. But even at this impossible height, Redford was fragmenting under pressures nobody saw. During filming of The Great Gatsby in 1974, he was consuming Valium to manage anxiety attacks that hit without warning. The famous golden hair that defined his image was starting to thin from stress, requiring careful styling to hide. He'd arrive on sets at 4 a.m. not for preparation, but to sit alone in his trailer, fighting the urge to drive away and never come back. "I had everything except the ability to enjoy any of it," he would later admit. Success felt like drowning in honey, sweet but suffocating. The public saw triumph after triumph. All the President's Men earning 8 Oscar nominations. 3 Days of the Condor, cementing his paranoid thriller persona. His influence reshaping how Hollywood approached political films. But privately, Redford was disappearing into Utah wilderness for days at a time, telling no one where he was going. He'd ride horses until exhaustion forced him to stop, seeking physical pain to override emotional numbness. His marriage to Lola was fracturing under the weight of his absences, physical when filming, emotional even when present. Between them were 4 children who knew their father more from movie screens than breakfast tables. Working with contemporaries like Newman, Dustin Hoffman, and Warren Beatty, Redford became known as the most controlling actor in Hollywood, demanding multiple takes, arguing with directors, sometimes directing scenes himself without credit. What they didn't know was this need for control came from terror of chaos, of the randomness that had taken his mother, that threatened his children, that lurked beneath every success. Sidney Pollack later revealed, Bob needed to control everything because he was convinced something terrible would happen if he didn't. Every film was an attempt to impose order on disorder. "Success is a beautiful prison," Redford once told his therapist during this period. "Everyone sees the golden bars and thinks you're lucky. They don't realize you're still in a cage, just a more expensive one." By 1975, at the absolute peak of his powers, Robert Redford had everything: critical acclaim, commercial success, creative control, and the beginnings of Sundance. But he also had a failing marriage, children who felt abandoned, and the growing certainty that he'd built an empire at a foundation of performance, playing Robert Redford so convincingly that even he'd forgotten who he really was. But even at the height of everything, the shadows were growing longer. Death was circling his family, preparing to take what success couldn't protect. Robert's marriage to Lola von Wagenen in 1958 had begun with the desperate hope of 2 young people who thought Mormon values and artistic ambition could coexist. She was a Utah native studying history. He was a troubled art student who saw in her stability everything his chaotic childhood lacked. They married when he was 22, before fame, when he was still Charles Redford Jr., who stuttered during auditions. "I thought I'd found my anchor," Redford would later reflect with visible regret. "Someone who could keep me grounded." But you can't anchor yourself to another person when you're already drowning. The marriage produced 4 children: Scott in 1959, Shauna in 1960, David in 1962, and Amy in 1970. But by then, Redford was more ghost than husband, present in photographs but absent in reality. The cracks showed early. Lola wanted a traditional Mormon life in Utah. family dinners, church on Sundays, predictability. Robert was driven by demons she couldn't understand, disappearing for days into the wilderness, returning exhausted but unable to explain where he'd been or why. His rising fame made everything worse. The man she'd married was becoming someone else. Robert Redford, the image that belonged to everyone except his family. Love in Hollywood means performing it for cameras, Lola once told a friend. We were better at playing a married couple in magazines than being one at home. The children grew up with a father who was physically present but emotionally unreachable, who'd sit at dinner tables planning escape routes. The tragedy that shattered everything came in October 1959 when their firstborn Scott died at just 2.5 months old from sudden infant death syndrome. Robert found him in the crib, blue and unresponsive, performing CPR until paramedics arrived, though he knew it was too late. The death destroyed something fundamental between Robert and Lola. They grieved separately, unable to comfort each other without being reminded of their failure to protect their child. We couldn't look at each other without seeing Scott's absence, Robert later admitted. Every happy moment felt like betrayal. He threw himself into work. She retreated into religion. They had 3 more children trying to fill the void, but it only emphasized what was missing. By 1975, the marriage was a performance for their children's sake. Robert was having affairs, not from desire, but from the need to feel something other than numbness. Lola knew but said nothing, preferring quiet dignity to public scandal. They separated in 1982, divorced in 1985 after 27 years, both exhausted from pretending. We failed at marriage, but succeeded at maintaining an illusion, Robert explained. We gave our children the appearance of stability while slowly disappearing from each other. The relationship pattern that emerged was deliberate distance. Robert dated actresses, Sonia Braga, Kathy O'Rear, but ended each relationship before genuine intimacy could develop. In 2009, at age 72, he married Sibylle Sagars, a German artist 40 years his junior. Friends described the marriage as companionate rather than passionate. 2 artists who understood solitude. She doesn't try to know me completely, Robert explained. She accepts that parts of me died with Scott, with my mother, with everyone I've lost. I learned that love means loss, Robert finally admitted in his 70s. Everyone I've truly loved has either died or left. So now I practice preventive detachment. I care from a distance that won't destroy me when they inevitably disappear. The man who played romantic leads couldn't sustain actual romance, had replaced intimacy with charm, connection with carefully managed proximity. In September 1983, Robert Redford collapsed on his Utah property while clearing brush, his heart racing at 180 beats per minute, chest pain radiating down his left arm. Classic heart attack symptoms that turned out to be severe panic disorder he'd been hiding for years. The diagnosis came after extensive tests ruled out cardiac issues, revealing instead that Redford had been experiencing panic attacks since Scott's death in 1959. Self-medicating with alcohol and work to avoid confronting the underlying trauma. His cortisol levels were dangerously elevated, his blood pressure spiking unpredictably. I'd been in fight-or-flight mode for 24 years, he told his doctor. I thought that was just how life felt after loss. The exact moment of realization came when the cardiologist asked about his last period of genuine calm. Redford couldn't remember one since before his mother's death in 1955. Brain scans revealed an overactive amygdala consistent with chronic anxiety and unprocessed grief. The physical manifestations were extensive: chronic insomnia, requiring increasing doses of sleep medication, tremors he hid by always holding something, difficulty swallowing during stress that made dining scenes torture. He'd been living with untreated PTSD from multiple losses, manifesting as hypervigilance about his family's safety and compulsive control over his environment. The treatment plan revealed how deeply Redford had been suffering in silence. Therapy uncovered that he couldn't remember large portions of 1959 to 1960 around Scott's death, his mind having essentially deleted the trauma. The therapist found layer upon layer of unprocessed grief: his mother, his son, his uncle's death that was never discussed, his father's emotional abandonment. "We discovered he'd never actually grieved," the therapist noted. "He just kept moving, using motion as medication." The famous control everyone saw as perfectionism was actually terror of chaos, of the randomness that had taken so much from him. During this period, Redford also received devastating news about his health. Years of hiding in the Utah sun while building Sundance had resulted in skin cancer, basal cell carcinoma that required multiple surgeries. He'd ignored warning signs for years, suspicious moles dismissed as cosmetic concerns. The surgeries left scars he'd hide with makeup during filming, another secret to manage. Additionally, decades of doing his own stunts had left him with chronic back pain requiring daily medication, torn rotator cuffs that made sleeping difficult, and arthritis that made riding horses, his one escape, increasingly painful. Recovery became about management rather than cure. Redford's daily routine included meditation he'd previously mocked, therapy twice weekly, and anti-anxiety medication he'd resisted for decades. He couldn't film certain scenes without preparation. Anything involving children in danger, medical emergencies, or sudden loss would trigger panic attacks. The man who'd built an image on stoic strength was finally admitting weakness, though only to his closest circle. The diagnosis was both devastating and liberating, Redford admitted to Sidney Pollack. Devastating to realize I'd been sick for decades without knowing it. Liberating to finally have a name for the thing that had been hunting me. The permanent effects were undeniable. Redford would always need medication, would always struggle with anxiety about loss, would always be managing rather than cured. The golden boy who seemed to glide through life had been drowning the entire time, just skilled at making drowning look like swimming. But at least now he understood why every success felt like a countdown to catastrophe. His body had been preparing for disaster since 1959, unable to accept that sometimes people just die, and it's nobody's fault. The call came at 5:30 a.m. on November 3, 2020. While Redford was at his Napa Valley home, his daughter Shauna's voice breaking as she delivered news that shattered his world. "Dad, Jamie is gone." His grandson, James Redford, filmmaker and activist, had died at 58 from bile duct cancer that had spread despite 2 liver transplants over decades. The son of his deceased son, Scott. Wait, that's incorrect. James was actually Robert's son with Lola, born David James Redford in 1962, who'd survived childhood illnesses to become a documentary filmmaker championing environmental causes. "I sat there unable to process it," Redford would later tell close friends. "Children aren't supposed to die before their parents, even when those children are 58. Jamie had been the child who'd filled the void after baby Scott's death, born when Robert was still struggling with that loss. He'd grown up in his father's shadow, but carved his own path, becoming a filmmaker focused on social justice rather than Hollywood entertainment. The relationship had been complicated. Jamie resented his father's emotional absence during childhood, but came to understand it as an adult when Robert finally opened up about Scott's death and his own struggles. They'd grown closer in recent years, collaborating on environmental documentaries, Jamie running the Redford Center that Robert had founded. "He became the son I learned how to be present for," Robert admitted. Too late for his childhood, but at least for his adulthood. The funeral was private, just family, held at Sundance with Jamie's environmental work celebrated. Robert attempted to speak but couldn't finish, his daughter Amy taking over while he stood frozen, staring at photos of Jamie's life. He wasn't crying, Shauna observed. He'd gone to that place he goes when things hurt too much, completely internal, unreachable. After the service, Robert disappeared into the Utah mountains for 3 days, concerning his family until he returned, exhausted and silent. What the public never knew was that Jamie's death triggered a cascade of health crises for Robert. His panic attacks returned with violence, his blood pressure spiking dangerously. He couldn't sleep without seeing Jamie as a child. Then Scott's blue face, his mother's hospital bed, all the losses colliding in his dreams. He became obsessed with his remaining children's health, calling them multiple times daily, funding medical screenings they didn't need. "Death keeps taking my children," he told his therapist. "First Scott as a baby, now Jamie. Who's next?" The aftermath revealed the true weight of accumulating losses. At 84, Robert had now buried a child twice. Scott in 1959, Jamie in 2020. Between them lay his parents, his Uncle David, countless friends from Paul Newman to Sidney Pollack. "I'm becoming a museum of grief," he said. "Every room in my mind holds someone dead." He stopped visiting Sundance, unable to bear the memories. The institute Jamie had helped run felt haunted. The loss changed his relationship with mortality. Robert began giving away possessions, updating his will obsessively, recording messages for grandchildren in case I'm not here. He told Sibyl he wanted to be buried at Sundance near Jamie, so he won't be alone. The man who'd built an empire on controlling narrative couldn't control death's random cruelty. "Jamie did everything right," Robert said. "He was good, purposeful, made the world better. And he's dead while I'm still here, having wasted decades running from feelings. Where's the justice in that?" The golden boy of Hollywood had become an old man counting losses, knowing that at 88, he had more people to mourn than years left to mourn them. By 2011, Robert Redford sat atop a fortune worth $170 million, owned properties worth $50 million, including his vast Sundance resort, and had just received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Barack Obama. But what the world didn't know was that Sundance Institute was hemorrhaging money at an unsustainable rate, requiring Redford to personally inject millions annually to keep his dream alive. The financial crisis of 2008 had devastated corporate sponsorships, attendance dropped 40%, and the Institute owed $8.5 million in debt. Between 2008 and 2011, Redford had personally covered $15 million in shortfalls, selling properties and artwork to maintain the facade of success. "I went from building a legacy to mortgaging it," Redford admitted to his board. "Sundance was supposed to outlive me. Instead, it's draining everything I built." The public transformation was subtle but telling. Redford began accepting acting roles he'd previously rejected. "The company you keep despite exhaustion, all is lost," where he was literally the only actor to save costs. Captain America. For Marvel money he once would have scorned. His quote dropped from $5 million to taking back-end deals that often yielded nothing. "I went from choosing art to needing paychecks," he observed. Same name, different desperation. Directors noticed he'd lost his famous perfectionism, accepting first takes, no longer arguing about character choices. He needed to work, not create. Behind the scenes, the restructuring was devastating. Redford sold his Connecticut estate for $7 million below asking price. His beloved Napa Valley property went on the market. The art collection, including Edward Hopper paintings worth millions, disappeared into private sales. He kept only the Utah properties, unable to let Sundance physically disappear even as it financially destroyed him. "I was selling my past to fund a future that might not exist," he told his financial advisor. "Every sale felt like accepting defeat." The survival tactics were humiliating for a man who defined independence. Redford licensed his name for documentaries he didn't watch, appeared at corporate events reading prepared statements about independent film while dying inside. He accepted honorary awards that came with speaking fees, standing at podiums barely able to see audiences through failing eyesight, repeating the same stories about Butch Cassidy to people who weren't born when it was filmed. Netflix offered him a development deal he took knowing nothing would be developed. They wanted his name, not his input. The slow rebuild never materialized. Films like The Old Man and the Gun in 2018, marketed as his final performance, earned critical praise but minimal box office. Sundance found new sponsors, but required Redford to step back from control, becoming a figurehead in his own institution. "Rock bottom at 80 isn't dramatic," he observed. "It's sitting in board meetings where they discuss your legacy in past tense while you're still in the room. It's being treated like a museum piece they dust off for galas. It's realizing that everything you built to escape Hollywood became another version of Hollywood." By 2020, the man who'd created independent film's most important platform was essentially a paid appearance at his own festival, smiling for photos while younger executives made decisions about the institution that bore his name but no longer belonged to him. By 2023, Robert Redford's appearance at the Sundance Film Festival became uncomfortable viewing when he struggled to navigate the stage, gripping his assistant's arm while his legs trembled with each step, forgetting mid-sentence why he was there until prompted by organizers. What the public didn't know was that Redford had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 2021, a condition he'd hidden through careful staging and limited appearances. The tremor in his left hand that photographers noticed was dismissed as age, but it was actually the progressive neurological decline that made holding a coffee cup require both hands. "I'm disappearing in public," he told his daughter Amy after the ceremony. "Every appearance is just documenting my deterioration." The cognitive changes were equally devastating. During interviews about his career, Redford would forget iconic films he'd made, stare blankly when asked about The Sting or All the President's Men. He'd confuse his children's names, calling Amy by his late mother's name, seeing Jamie in every room, though his son had been dead for 3 years. His wife, Sybil, became his constant translator, finishing his sentences, redirecting confused responses. "He exists in fragments," she told close friends. "Sometimes he's fully present. Sometimes he's in 1973. Sometimes he's nowhere at all." Public speculation about his condition became cruel entertainment. Social media dissected every appearance, comparing recent footage to his golden years, diagnosing everything from dementia to alcoholism. Comment sections filled with observations about his vacant stare and confused rambling. When a video leaked of Redford unable to remember Paul Newman's name during a tribute, calling him "that actor friend," it went viral with millions of views. The man who defined American masculinity was reduced to inspiration porn and cautionary tales about aging. The isolation had become complete. Redford withdrew to his Napa Valley home, refusing visitors, communicating mainly through Sibylla or assistants. Friends from his golden era were mostly dead, Newman, Pollock, Nichols, leaving him with memories he couldn't fully access. He'd sit watching his old films without recognizing himself, asking Sybil who the blonde actor was, becoming agitated when told it was him. "That's not me," he'd insist. "I would remember being him." Recent developments only deepened the tragedy. Sundance Institute quietly removed him from decision-making roles, keeping him as founder in name only. His attempt to attend the 2024 festival was canceled, when he couldn't remember what Sundance was during preparatory meetings. His children took control of his finances after he tried to donate millions to a conservation project he'd already funded years earlier. The Utah property he'd fought to preserve was being prepared for sale after his death, the family unable to maintain it. "I've become what I always feared," Redford admitted during a lucid moment to his doctor. "Someone going through the motions without understanding why. I know I was someone important, but I can't feel it. It's like reading about a stranger who happened to use my name." The man who'd built Sundance as a fortress against Hollywood's chaos couldn't remember building it. At 88, Robert Redford had achieved the cruelest fate, living long enough to forget everything that made him Robert Redford, existing as a ghost haunting his own legend while the world watched him fade. Today, at 89, Robert Redford lives not as the golden boy who defined American cinema, but as a man learning that sometimes the hardest role is simply remembering who you were. He rises each morning in his Napa Valley home, if morning has meaning when time has lost structure, helped by nurses who dress someone who no longer understands why clothes matter. Guided through routines that exist without purpose he can grasp. What remains are fragments. Watching old westerns without recognizing himself, Utah mountains visible from windows that might as well be paintings, his wife Sibyl protecting someone who sometimes doesn't know her name. His net worth, still roughly $100 million, ensures perpetual care, but cannot purchase what Parkinson's has stolen. Sundance continues without his input, using his name while he can't remember creating it. The universal message in Redford's story speaks to anyone who has built something larger than themselves only to forget they built it, who has outlived their own legend, who discovers that sometimes survival itself becomes the cruelest fate. Your struggle is valid. Your grief is real. Sometimes continuing is the only victory available. If this story moved you, share your thoughts below. Leave a like for the human being behind the legend.